The sun scorched the Wyoming earth as Zara Owens lay helpless, sand pressing against every inch of her body up to her neck. A cruel punishment orchestrated by the Blackburn Gang for refusing to reveal where her father had hidden the deed to their ranch. The Outlaws had ridden off laughing, leaving her to die under the merciless August sun of 1879, miles from Opal where anyone might hear her screams. Zara's throat had gone raw from shouting, her lips cracked and bleeding from the heat. She had stopped counting the hours, focusing instead on the vultures that had begun to circle overhead. Her honey-blonde hair, once pinned neatly under her bonnet, now hung in limp strands around her dirt-streaked face, the bonnet itself tossed carelessly a few feet away by the leader of the gang. "I ain't telling you nothin'," she had spat at Jacob Blackburn earlier that day, even as his men dug the hole that would become her living grave. "Suit yourself, Miss Owens," he had replied with a cruel smile. "Perhaps the desert will change your mind. If it does, pray someone passes by before your buzzard food." The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through her haze of dehydration. Hope flickered briefly before dread replaced it, the Blackburn Gang returning to torment her further. Zara closed her eyes, determined not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her fear. "Sweet merciful heaven," a deep voice exclaimed, not belonging to any of the outlaws she'd come to recognize. Zara's eyes flew open to see a tall figure dismounting a chestnut stallion. The stranger approached cautiously, pulling his bandana down to reveal a face weathered by sun and wind, but with eyes so intensely blue they reminded her of the mountain lakes she'd seen as a child. "Miss, are you?" he stopped, the absurdity of asking if she was all right apparent even to him. "Hold on, I'll get you out." The man, a cowboy judging by his attire, dropped to his knees and began clawing at the packed earth around her with bare hands, having discarded his gloves to work faster. "Name's Reed Zimmerman," he said between labored breaths, digging frantically. "Was tracking a stray when I saw something that didn't belong in this stretch of desert." "Zara," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Zara Owens, the Blackburn Gang. Save your strength, Miss Owens, I know of Blackburn." His jaw clenched as he continued digging, sand wedging painfully under his fingernails. Minutes stretched like hours as Reed worked, the skin of his hands beginning to tear. Blood mixed with sand, but he didn't slow his pace. Finally, he had excavated enough that he could slip his arms beneath hers and pull. With a mighty effort, he extracted her from the earth's cruel embrace. Zara's legs crumpled beneath her, numb from constriction. Reed caught her before she fell, lifting her as though she weighed nothing. He carried her to his horse and carefully positioned her in the saddle before mounting behind her. "My father," she whispered as they began to ride, her body leaning limply against his chest. "They'll kill him if I don't return with the deed." Reed's arm tightened protectively around her waist. "We'll get to Opal before they do any more harm, Miss Owens. You have my word." The journey to Opal was a blur for Zara, consciousness coming and going. She was vaguely aware of Reed's strong arms keeping her upright, of his deep voice murmuring reassurances, and of the occasional trickle of water he'd offer from his canteen. By the time they reached Opal's main street, the sun was beginning its descent. Reed rode directly to Dr. Montgomery's office, barely acknowledging the startled looks of the townspeople as he carried Zara's dusty, half-conscious form inside. "Good God, man, what happened?" Dr. Montgomery exclaimed, clearing his examination table with a sweep of his arm. "Blackburn Gang," Reed replied grimly, laying Zara down with gentle hands. "Buried her up to her neck out in the Badlands." The doctor's face darkened as he began his examination. "Those animals. Sheriff Holden's been trying to bring them in for months." He glanced at Reed's hands, mangled and bleeding. "You'll need those tended to as well, son." Reed shook his head. "See to Miss Owens first. I need to find Sheriff Holden. Her father's in danger." Zara's fingers suddenly clutched at Reed's sleeve. "My father's at our ranch," she whispered. 5 miles north. The Lazio, please, help him." Reed gently pried her fingers loose. "I'll bring him back safe, Miss Owens. You rest now." Outside, Reed found Sheriff Holden already approaching the doctor's office, drawn by the commotion. "Zimmerman," the older man acknowledged with a nod. "Heard you brought in Thomas Owens's daughter looking half dead." "Blackburn's work," Reed confirmed, flexing his bloodied hands. "They're after the Owens ranch deed. Miss Owens says her father's still at the ranch." The sheriff's weathered face grew grim. "Blackburn's been buying up every piece of land between here and the railroad survey lines. Word is the Union Pacific's planning a new spur through this territory. We need to ride for the Lazy-O," Reed insisted. "Now," Sheriff Holden nodded, turning to the small crowd that had gathered. "Jenkins, McPherson, saddle up. Moore, fetch Deputy Williams from the saloon. Rest of you men willing to stand against Blackburn, we could use your guns." Within 15 minutes, Reed found himself riding with a posse of 8 men, his hands hastily bandaged by the doctor before departure. The pain was considerable, but nothing compared to the urgency he felt. Despite having just met Zara Owens, something about her courage in the face of such cruelty had stirred something within him. Perhaps it was her determination, or the flash of fire in her amber eyes even when she was at death's door. Whatever it was, Reed knew he would not rest until she and her father were safe. The Lazy-O came into view as twilight settled across the Wyoming plains. The modest ranch house and barn stood silhouetted against the darkening sky, seemingly peaceful. "Too peaceful. Hold up," Sheriff Holden ordered in a low voice. "Something ain't right." Reed narrowed his eyes, scanning the property. No lamps lit, no smoke from the chimney. "Spread out," the sheriff commanded. "Approach slow and quiet." The men fanned out, advancing cautiously toward the ranch buildings. Reed, despite his injured hands, kept his rifle ready. As they neared the house, a shot rang out, kicking up dirt near Reed's horse. "That's far enough." A voice called from the darkness of the barn. "I've got a shotgun trained on you, and I won't hesitate to use it." Reed recognized the desperate edge in the voice. "Mr. Owens," he called back. "Thomas Owens, we're here to help. Sheriff Holden's with us." A moment of silence followed. "Holden." "That you?" "It's me, Thomas," the sheriff confirmed. "Come on out, you're among friends." Slowly, a figure emerged from the barn, shotgun still raised. Thomas Owens was a tall man with the same honey-blonde hair as his daughter, though his was streaked with gray. His face was haggard, a nasty bruise darkening one cheek. "Where's my daughter?" he demanded, lowering the shotgun only slightly. "Blackburn's men took her this morning." Reed dismounted carefully. "She's safe, Mr. Owens, in town with Dr. Montgomery. I found her out in the Badlands." The shotgun finally lowered completely as relief washed over Thomas Owens's face. "Thank God," I thought. His voice broke. "They said they'd kill her if I didn't hand over the deed." "Why didn't you just give it to them?" Jenkins asked from atop his horse. Thomas's expression hardened. "Because it's not just about the land. This deed proves that Blackburn's been forging documents. He's been stealing land all through the territory with fake papers. My deed shows the true boundaries, signed by the territorial governor himself." Sheriff Holden whistled low. "That's enough to hang Blackburn. And he knows it," Thomas confirmed. "That's why he's so desperate to get it." "Where is it now?" Reed asked. Thomas looked at him appraisingly, seeming to make a decision. "Hidden, somewhere even Blackburn's men couldn't find it when they tore my house apart." He gestured to the open door where upturned furniture and scattered belongings were visible in the fading light. "We need to get you to town," Sheriff Holden said. "Blackburn's not the type to give up easily. When he finds out his men failed to break your daughter, he'll come back with more firepower." Thomas nodded grimly. "Let me gather a few things. The deed comes with us." As Thomas disappeared into the ransacked house, Reed followed, wanting to assist despite his injured hands. "Mr. Owens," he said quietly, "your daughter showed incredible courage today. She never gave Blackburn what he wanted, even when they—" He couldn't finish the sentence, the image of Zara buried in the sand still too vivid. Thomas paused in gathering his belongings, his eyes meeting Reed's. "You saved her life, didn't you?" "I just happened to be in the right place." Thomas glanced down at Reed's bandaged hands. Those don't look like the hands of someone who just happened to be there. Those look like the hands of a man who dug until he couldn't dig anymore. Reed looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. Any decent man would have done the same. Not many decent men left in these parts, Thomas replied, reaching behind a loose floorboard to retrieve a metal box. This is what they were after. Within minutes, they had joined the others outside. Thomas rode double with one of the men, clutching his precious metal box. As they turned toward Opal, Reed couldn't help but look back at the Lazio. Something told him Blackburn wouldn't wait long to return, and when he did, he would come with everything he had. Back in town, Zara had been moved to a room above the doctor's office. When Thomas rushed in, the reunion between father and daughter brought tears to the eyes of even the hardened men who had ridden in the posse. Reed hung back, allowing them their privacy, but Zara's eyes found his over her father's shoulder. The gratitude in her gaze made his torn hands seem a small price to pay. "Sheriff," Thomas said after the emotional reunion, "we need to get this deed to the territorial judge." "It's the only way to stop Blackburn permanently." Sheriff Holden stroked his mustache thoughtfully. "Judge Parker won't be back through Opal for another 2 weeks. In the meantime, Blackburn's going to come looking for you both." "Then we need to be ready," Reed interjected. All eyes turned to him. "Blackburn's not going to let this go. He'll come for the deed, and he won't care who gets hurt in the process." The sheriff nodded grimly. "We'll set up a defensive perimeter around the town, post men on the rooftops, keep the women and children in the center of town where they'll be safest." "It won't be enough," Thomas argued. "Blackburn's got at least 15 men riding with him. How many guns can you muster?" "Maybe 12 reliable men," Sheriff Holden admitted. "The rest are either too old, too young, or too afraid of Blackburn's reputation." Reed's mind raced. They needed a plan that didn't rely solely on outgunning Blackburn. "What if we don't wait for him to come to us? What if we bring the fight to him?" "That's suicide," the deputy protested. "Not if we're smart about it," Reed countered. "Blackburn's camped at the old Sullivan place, right?" "I know that terrain. There's a way to approach without being seen, if a small group could get close enough." "To do what?" Thomas asked. "Even if we could get close, we're still outnumbered," Reed smiled grimly. "Not if we create a diversion first. Draw most of his men away from camp, then hit what's left from behind." A calculating look crossed the sheriff's face. "That might work, but who would be the bait?" "I will," Zara's voice cut through the room. She had been silent until now, sitting propped up in bed, but her eyes burned with determination. "I'm what Blackburn wants, or rather, what he thinks I know." "Absolutely not," Thomas protested immediately. "Pa, listen," Zara insisted. "Blackburn thinks I know where the deed is. If he hears I've been seen riding out of town alone, seemingly recovered, he'll think I'm either running or going to retrieve the deed. Either way, he'll send men after me." Reed shook his head. "It's too dangerous, Miss Owens. You've been through enough already." Zara's eyes locked with his. "And I survived, thanks to you. But this isn't just about me or my father anymore. It's about everyone Blackburn has hurt, everyone whose land he's stolen. If we don't stop him now, who will?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Reed could see the resolve in Zara's face, a determination that matched the courage she'd shown in the desert. It was foolhardy, reckless even, but he couldn't help but admire her spirit. "She wouldn't actually be alone," Sheriff Holden said slowly, thinking it through. "We'd have men hidden along the route, ready to protect her if things go wrong. And I'd be right beside her," Reed added, surprising even himself with the vehemence in his voice. Thomas looked between Reed and his daughter, seeing something pass between them that made him sigh heavily. "I don't like it, but I don't see many other options that don't end with a lot of good people dead." The plan took shape over the next few hours. Zara would ride out at dawn, apparently alone but with Reed and 2 deputies concealed not far behind. They would take the main road toward Cheyenne, making sure to be spotted by one of Blackburn's scouts they knew patrolled the area. Meanwhile, Sheriff Holden, Thomas, and the rest of their men would circle around to approach Blackburn's camp from the rear. As the meeting broke up, Reed found himself alone with Zara for the first time since bringing her to the doctor. Her color had improved, and though she still looked weak, there was a fire in her eyes that hadn't been extinguished by her ordeal. "Thank you," she said simply. "For saving my life out there." Reed shook his head. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Zara replied firmly, "not anyone, and certainly not the way you did." She reached out, gently taking one of his bandaged hands in hers. "Dr. Montgomery told me how bad these are. Said you dug until there wasn't any skin left on your palms." Reed's throat tightened at her touch. "I couldn't leave you there." "Why?" she asked softly. "You didn't know me, I was just a stranger." "Some things you don't need to think about," Reed answered after a moment. "You see someone in trouble, you help, that's all there is to it." A small smile touched Zara's lips. "Is that the cowboy code, Mr. Zimmerman?" Despite the gravity of their situation, Reed found himself returning her smile. "Something like that, Miss Owens. Though I suspect you know a thing or two about standing by your principles, given what you endured rather than betray your father." The smile faded from Zara's face. "I was so scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "When they started shoveling that sand around me, I almost told them everything. Part of me wishes I had." Reed's hand turned in hers, careful of his injuries but wanting to offer comfort. "But you didn't. That kind of courage isn't about not being afraid, Miss Owens. It's about doing what's right even when you're terrified." Zara's eyes searched his. "Like riding out as bait for a gang of outlaws, that's different," Reed frowned. "That's exactly the same," Zara interrupted. "And don't try to talk me out of it now, we both know it's our best chance." Reed sighed, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. "At least get some rest tonight. Tomorrow will come soon enough." As he turned to leave, Zara called after him, "Mr. Zimmerman?" When he looked back, she continued, "I'd be honored if you'd call me Zara." Something warm unfurled in Reed's chest. "Only if you'll call me Reed." Her smile was the last thing he saw before closing the door, and it stayed with him as he made his way to the sheriff's office where he'd been offered a cot for the night. Despite the pain in his hands and the danger that awaited them tomorrow, Reed Zimmerman fell asleep more at peace than he'd felt in years. Dawn broke clear and cold over Opal. Reed stood in the shadow of the livery stable, watching as Zara mounted her father's bay mare. She wore men's riding clothes borrowed from a neighbor's son that concealed her feminine form at a distance. Her honey-blonde hair was tucked up under a wide-brimmed hat. The disguise wouldn't fool anyone up close, but it might buy precious seconds of confusion. "Remember," Sheriff Holden instructed her quietly, "you're just leading them away. At the first sign of trouble, you ride hard for the creek where Reed and the others will be waiting. Don't try to be a hero." Zara nodded, her face solemn. Her eyes found Reed's across the street, and she gave him a small nod of reassurance. Then she turned her horse and rode slowly out of town, the rising sun at her back. Reed waited 10 minutes before following with deputies Jenkins and Moore. They took a parallel route, keeping to the tree line where they could maintain sight of Zara while remaining concealed themselves. The morning air was crisp, the Wyoming landscape painted in hues of gold and amber by the early light. They had ridden about 3 miles when Reed spotted them 2 riders breaking from a copse of trees to follow Zara. Blackburn's scouts, just as they'd predicted. Reed signaled to the deputies, and they increased their pace, still hidden but moving faster to ensure they could intercept if needed. Zara gave no indication she'd spotted her pursuers, maintaining her steady pace. Reed's admiration for her courage grew with each passing minute. Most people who'd been through what she had would be halfway to Denver by now, not deliberately riding back into danger. Another mile passed before the scouts made their move, suddenly spurring their horses to a gallop. Zara, hearing them approach, kicked her mare into a run. The chase was on. "Now," Reed shouted to the deputies, and they broke cover, racing to intercept the pursuers before they could reach Zara. The scouts, suddenly finding themselves pursued as well, split up, one continuing after Zara while the other wheeled to face the new threat. Reed focused on the man still chasing Zara, trusting the deputies to handle the second scout. Despite the pain that shot through his hands as he gripped the reins, Reed urged his horse faster. He was gaining on them when the scout suddenly raised his rifle, aiming at Zara's back. Without hesitation, Reed drew his own weapon and fired. The shot went wide, but it was enough to distract the scout, who turned to return fire. The momentary diversion allowed Zara to increase her lead, heading for the creek where they had planned to make their stand if necessary. Reed ducked low in the saddle as bullets whistled past. His second shot found its mark, striking the scout's shoulder. The man cried out, losing his balance and tumbling from his horse. Reed thundered past him without stopping, focused solely on reaching Zara. She had reached the creek and taken position behind a large boulder, her father's rifle ready. Relief washed over her face as she recognized Reed approaching. "The others," she called as he dismounted beside her. "Handling the second scout," Reed replied, wincing as he flexed his damaged hands. "You all right?" Zara nodded, her eyes dropping to his bloodied bandages. "Your hands, they're bleeding again." "They'll hold," Reed assured her, "but we need to move. That scout will have friends coming once he gets his wits about him." As if summoned by his words, the sound of multiple horses reached them. Reed peered carefully around the boulder to see 5 riders approaching fast, too many for just the 2 of them to handle. "Where are Jenkins and Moore?" Zara whispered anxiously. Reed shook his head, unsure. "We can't wait. We need to get to higher ground." They mounted quickly and rode along the creek bed, keeping the water between them and their pursuers. The creek led toward a series of rocky outcroppings that would provide better cover and a defensible position. Behind them, shouts and gunfire indicated that the outlaws had found their trail. Reed pushed their pace, guiding them through the shallow water to minimize tracks. Zara matched him move for move, her earlier weakness apparently forgotten in the face of danger. They reached the rocks just as the first of their pursuers came into view. Reed helped Zara dismount and sent the horses away with a slap to their rumps. They'd need to be on foot for what came next. "This way," he directed, leading her through a narrow passage between towering boulders. The path wound upward, offering increasingly commanding views of the approach below. Finally, they reached a natural shelf that provided both cover and visibility. "Perfect," Reed murmured, setting up their position. "We can see them coming, but they'll have a hard time getting a clear shot at us." Zara took up position beside him, rifle ready. "How long do we need to hold them?" "Your father and the sheriff should be hitting Blackburn's camp soon. Once they realize they've been drawn away from their boss, these men will likely head back to help. And if they don't—" Zara's voice was steady, but Reed could see the fear she was fighting to control. He met her gaze directly. "Then we make every shot count." The first of Blackburn's men appeared below, dismounting to examine the ground where the creek met the rocks. Reed and Zara remained perfectly still, knowing that movement would give away their position more surely than anything. "They split up here," one of the outlaws called to the others. "2 sets of tracks heading up into the rocks." "Fan out," ordered a burly man with a red bandana, clearly the leader of this group. "Palmer, you and Davis circle around to the east. Carson with me. Bell, stay with the horses." Reed leaned close to Zara's ear. "They're dividing their forces. That improves our odds." She nodded, her shoulder pressed against his as they waited. The outlaws began their ascent, moving cautiously, guns drawn. Reed tracked their progress, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal their presence. "When I give the signal," he whispered, "take the one on the left. I'll handle the right." "Ready." Zara took a deep breath, sighting along her rifle. "Ready." They waited until the 2 men climbing directly toward them were halfway up the rocky slope, too committed to their path to easily retreat. "Now," Reed said softly, and 2 shots rang out almost as one. The outlaw on the left cried out, clutching his leg as he tumbled backward down the slope. The second man dove for cover, unharmed but pinned down by their superior position. Shouts erupted from below as the remaining outlaws realized they were under fire. A barrage of bullets peppered the rocks around Reed and Zara, forcing them to duck lower. "So much for surprise," Zara remarked grimly, reloading her rifle with practiced hands. Reed nodded, impressed by her composure. "They know where we are, but they still have to come up after us, and that's not going to be easy." For the next 20 minutes, they held their position against increasingly determined attempts to reach them. The outlaws tried approaching from different angles, only to be driven back by carefully placed shots. Reed's hands screamed in agony each time he fired, but he ignored the pain, focusing solely on keeping Zara safe. "I'm down to my last few rounds," Zara reported after repelling yet another attempt. Reed checked his own ammunition with a frown. "Same here. We need to make every shot count now." Below, the outlaw leader was gathering his men for what appeared to be a coordinated rush from multiple directions. Reed realized with sinking certainty that they couldn't stop them all. "Zara," he said quietly, "there's a narrow path behind us that leads higher up. If we get overrun, I want you to take it and keep going. Don't look back." She turned to him, her amber eyes flashing with indignation. "I'm not leaving you. This isn't up for debate," Reed insisted. "Your father risked everything to protect that deed. If Blackburn gets his hands on you," "I said no," Zara interrupted fiercely. "We stand together or not at all. I've made my choice, Reed Zimmerman. Don't ask me to abandon you now." Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, an understanding that went beyond words. Reed found himself nodding, accepting her decision even as part of him raged against the danger it put her in. "Then we make our stand here," he said, "together." Below, the outlaws were preparing for their final assault when the sound of distant gunfire reached them. The men paused, looking back in the direction they had come from. "That's coming from camp," one of them called uncertainly. The leader hesitated, clearly torn between capturing their quarry and responding to what might be an attack on their main force. After a moment of indecision, he barked an order. "Palmer, Carson, stay here and finish these two. The rest of you with me back to camp." 3 of the outlaws mounted quickly and galloped away, leaving just 2 to continue the assault. Reed and Zara exchanged glances. The odds had just improved dramatically. "I'll take the one on the right," Zara said, raising her rifle once more. The remaining outlaws, perhaps emboldened by having fewer comrades to share the glory with, began a determined climb toward their position. Reed and Zara held their fire, waiting until the men were fully exposed on the rocky slope. When the moment came, their shots rang out simultaneously. One outlaw fell immediately while the second staggered but continued his advance, returning fire wildly. A bullet grazed Reed's arm, tearing his sleeve and drawing blood. He ignored it, taking careful aim for a second shot that dropped the final assailant. A sudden silence fell over the rocks, broken only by their heavy breathing and the distant echo of gunfire from Blackburn's camp. "We did it," Zara said, disbelief and relief mingling in her voice. Reed nodded, scanning the area below to ensure no threats remained. "The sheriff and your father must have reached the camp. That's what drew the others away." "Should we join them?" Zara asked, already moving to retrieve what ammunition she could from their fallen adversaries. Reed considered their options. "It's too risky. We don't know who's winning that fight. Better to secure our position here in case Blackburn's men return." They settled in to wait, Reed using his bandana to bind the graze on his arm while Zara kept watch. The distant gunfire continued sporadically for nearly an hour before gradually falling silent. "What do you think that means?" Zara asked, tension evident in her voice. Before Reed could answer, the sound of approaching riders reached them. They raised their rifles, ready for another confrontation, only to lower them in relief as Sheriff Holden's voice called up to them. "Zimmerman, Miss Owens, you up there." They emerged from their rocky fortress to find Sheriff Holden, Thomas Owens, and several townsmen gathered below. Thomas dismounted immediately, rushing forward to embrace his daughter as she scrambled down the slope. "Thank God you're safe," he murmured into her hair, holding her tightly. Sheriff Holden approached Reed, taking in his bloodied bandages and torn sleeve with a grim nod. "Looks like you had your hands full here." "Nothing we couldn't handle," Reed replied, eyes still on Zara and her father. "How did it go at the camp?" A satisfied smile spread across the sheriff's weathered face. "We got him. Jacob Blackburn is currently enjoying the hospitality of Opal's finest jail cell along with 6 of his men. The rest are either dead or scattered to the wind." Relief washed over Reed. "And the deed?" "Safe," Thomas confirmed, one arm still around Zara's shoulders. "And soon to be in the hands of the territorial judge. Blackburn's land-grabbing days are over." The ride back to Opal was triumphant, though subdued by exhaustion. Reed found himself riding beside Zara, occasionally catching her eye with a small smile that she readily returned. Something had changed between them during their stand on those rocks, a bond forged in danger that felt unbreakable. "Back in town, Doctor." Montgomery insisted on treating Reed's injured hands and arm properly this time, no matter his protests that others needed attention more. "These hands need proper care, young man," the doctor scolded as he cleaned and rebandaged the raw, torn flesh. "Your lucky infection hasn't set in already." Reed submitted to the treatment, aware of Zara watching from across the room where her own minor injuries were being tended. When their eyes met, he felt a warmth that had nothing to do with his wounds. That evening, a small celebration broke out at the Opal Saloon. The defeat of the Blackburn Gang meant safety for the entire region, and everyone wanted to share in the victory. Reed, however, found himself seeking quieter company, sitting on the porch of the doctor's office where Zara was resting once more. "Shouldn't you be enjoying your hero's welcome?" she asked as he settled into the chair beside her. Reed shook his head, never much cared for crowds or being called a hero. "Even when it's true," Zara's voice was soft, her eyes reflecting the golden glow of the setting sun. "Especially then," he replied with a small smile. "Besides, I wasn't alone out there. You were every bit as brave." Zara looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "I was terrified the whole time, just like when they buried me in that sand." "Yet you didn't break," Reed observed. "Not then, not today." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sounds of celebration from the saloon. "What will you do now?" Zara finally asked. "Return to your regular life," Reed considered the question. The truth was, he'd been drifting for years, taking work where he could find it, never staying in one place long. There had been nothing to keep him anywhere until now. "I hadn't really thought about it," he admitted. "Though I hear the Lazy-O might need some help rebuilding after Blackburn's men ransacked it." Zara's face brightened. "Pa would be glad for the help. We lost our foreman last winter and haven't found anyone suitable to replace him." "I wasn't angling for a job," Reed clarified quickly. "I know," Zara replied, a small smile playing at her lips. "But the offer stands all the same. Besides, those hands won't be fit for much else for a while." Reed looked down at his heavily bandaged hands and chuckled. "You make a fair point, Miss Owens." "Zara," she corrected gently. "After everything, I think we're well past formalities, don't you?" Reed met her gaze, finding himself drawn into the warmth of her amber eyes. "Zara," he repeated, the name feeling right on his lips. The moment was interrupted by Thomas Owens stepping onto the porch. "Evening, Zimmerman," he greeted. "Doc says my daughter should rest, but she's always been stubborn about following advice." "Just enjoying some fresh air, Pa," Zara protested mildly. Thomas smiled fondly at her before turning back to Reed. "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did. Not just today, but for saving my daughter's life yesterday. If there's ever anything I can do for you, you need only ask." Reed stood, extending his bandaged hand despite the pain. "No thanks necessary, sir. But I was just telling Zara that I'd be happy to help get the Lazy-O back in shape, if you could use an extra pair of hands once these heal up a bit." Thomas shook Reed's hand carefully, his eyes appraising. "We could certainly use the help, and something tells me you know your way around a ranch." "Grew up on one in Montana," Reed confirmed. "Been working cattle since I could walk." Thomas nodded, apparently satisfied. Then consider yourself hired, Mr. Zimmerman. We can discuss terms once we're all back at the ranch. As Thomas went inside to check on some of the other wounded townspeople, Reed settled back beside Zara, acutely aware of her pleased expression. "Looks like you'll be staying in Opal for a while," she observed. Reed smiled, feeling more at peace with that prospect than he would have thought possible just days ago. "Looks that way." The weeks that followed saw a transformation in Opal. Jacob Blackburn and his captured men were transported to Cheyenne for trial, with Thomas Owens's deed providing crucial evidence of their land fraud. The scattered remnants of the gang fled the territory, unwilling to face justice without their leader. At the Lazy O, rebuilding began in earnest. Reed, despite his still healing hands, proved invaluable in organizing repairs and rehiring ranch hands who had been driven away by Blackburn's threats. Thomas Owens, impressed by Reed's knowledge and work ethic, quickly came to rely on him as more than just a hired hand. Zara, meanwhile, seemed to blossom after her ordeal. Rather than being broken by what she had endured, she emerged stronger, more determined to live life on her own terms. She worked alongside the men during the day, helping to restore their home, and in the evenings often sat with Reed on the porch, talking long into the night. It was during one such evening, nearly a month after the confrontation with Blackburn, that Reed finally gave voice to what had been growing between them. "I never believed much in fate," he said as they watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. "Always figured a man made his own way in the world." Zara glanced at him curiously. "And now," Reed flexed his hands, the newly healed skin still pink and tender. "Now I wonder, what were the odds that I'd be tracking that stray exactly when and where you needed someone to find you? What if I'd gone in a different direction that day?" "I try not to think about that," Zara admitted softly. "It's too frightening." Reed turned to face her directly, gathering his courage. "I've been thinking a lot about that day. About why I couldn't leave you there, why I had to get you out no matter what it took. At first, I thought it was just basic human decency. And now," Zara's voice was barely above a whisper, her eyes never leaving his. "Now I think it was something more," Reed said, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "Like my life was leading me to that moment to you, even though I didn't know it." Zara's hand found his, fingers intertwining carefully to avoid the still tender places. "I've been thinking the same thing. About how sometimes the worst days of our lives can lead us to the best people." Reed felt his heart swell at her words. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward until their foreheads touched. "Zara Owens, I think I've been falling in love with you since I first saw you in that desert, fighting to survive when most would have given up." Her free hand came up to cup his cheek. "And I've been falling in love with you since you dug until your hands bled to save a woman you'd never met." When their lips finally met, it felt like the most natural conclusion to a journey that had begun in the harshest circumstances imaginable. The kiss was gentle, mindful of wounds still healing, but filled with promise of all that might come. Neither noticed Thomas Owens watching from the window, a small smile of approval on his face as he quietly withdrew to give them privacy. As summer turned to fall, the Lazy O flourished under Reed's management and Thomas's guidance. The ranch expanded its operations, buying cattle from neighboring spreads that had fallen on hard times. Reed, officially the foreman but treated more like family, moved into a small cabin on the property that he spent his spare time improving. His courtship of Zara progressed with a slow deliberateness that suited them both. They had survived desperation and violence together. Now they had the luxury of discovering each other in quieter moments. Rides across the Wyoming plains, dinners in town, dances at community gatherings, each experience shared deepened their connection. By the time the first snow fell, Reed knew with absolute certainty that he wanted to spend his life with Zara. The question was how and when to ask her. He wanted the moment to be perfect, a counterbalance to the violence that had brought them together. The opportunity presented itself unexpectedly. A November cattle drive had gone well, bringing a substantial profit that would see the ranch comfortably through the winter. To celebrate, Thomas proposed a trip into Opal for dinner at the hotel, the finest establishment in town. As they rode toward town, Zara beside him and Thomas following a respectful distance behind, Reed felt the small box in his pocket like a brand against his skin. He had purchased the ring in Cheyenne during his last trip, a modest gold band set with a small diamond that had cost him most of his savings. The town of Opal was preparing for winter, the streets quieter than they had been in summer but still bustling with activity. As they passed the doctor's office, Reed noticed Zara's gaze lingering on the building. "Strange to think that's where we really began," she commented, as if reading his thoughts. Reed nodded, suddenly struck by inspiration. "Would you mind if we took a short detour before dinner? There's something I'd like to show you." Zara looked curious but nodded her agreement. Reed signaled to Thomas, who waved them on with an understanding smile that made Reed wonder if the older man suspected his intentions. They rode past the main street, following a trail that led toward the outskirts of town. As they crested a small rise, the landscape opened before them, rolling plains stretching toward distant mountains, the land bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. "It's beautiful," Zara breathed, reining in her horse beside his. Reed dismounted, coming around to help her down. "This is where I was when I first spotted you that day," he explained, taking her hand and leading her to the edge of the rise. "I was tracking that stray up here when something caught my eye in the distance, something that didn't belong." Zara squeezed his hand, her expression solemn as she looked out over the landscape where she had nearly died. "I never knew exactly where it happened. I was blindfolded when they took me there. Over there," Reed pointed to a distant patch of barren ground, "about 5 miles. I almost didn't investigate, nearly convinced myself it was nothing." "But you did," Zara said softly. "You came for me." Reed turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "And I always will, Zara Owens, whenever you need me, for as long as I live." Understanding dawned in her eyes as Reed slowly lowered himself to one knee, wincing slightly as the cold ground pressed against his leg. "I brought you here because this is where everything changed for me," he continued, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "This is where my life found its purpose. I didn't know it then, but I was riding toward my future that day." Zara's eyes glistened with unshed tears as Reed reached into his pocket to retrieve the small box. "I don't have much to offer except my heart and my hands," he said, opening the box to reveal the ring. "But both are yours entirely if you'll have them. Zara Owens, will you marry me?" For a moment, Zara simply looked at him, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. Then she nodded, a smile breaking through like sunshine after rain. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Reed Zimmerman, I will marry you." As he slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that once bled for her, Reed felt a profound sense of rightness settle over him. When he stood and took her in his arms, their kiss sealed a promise that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances. They were married on Christmas Eve in the small church in Opal, with Thomas giving away the bride and the entire town turning out to celebrate. Dr. Montgomery, who had treated both their wounds, served as Reed's best man. Even Sheriff Holden abandoned his usual stoic demeanor to raise a glass to the couple whose love story had become something of a legend in the territory. "To finding love in the harshest of circumstances," the sheriff toasted, "and to the hands that bled to save it." Winter passed in a blur of happiness as Reed and Zara settled into married life in an expanded version of his cabin. Thomas had insisted they have their own home on the ranch property, though he remained in the main house where they joined him for most meals. By spring, the Lazy O was thriving as never before. Reed's innovations had increased productivity, and word of Thomas Owens's fair dealing brought business from all across the territory. When Zara announced that she was expecting their first child, it seemed the culmination of a blessing none of them had dared hope for after the dark days of Blackburn's terror. One evening in late April, as Reed and Zara sat on their porch watching the sunset, a rider approached from the direction of town. Reed recognized him as Jenkins, now a full deputy under Sheriff Holden. "Evening, deputy," Reed called as the man dismounted. "What brings you out to the Lazy O?" Jenkins removed his hat, nodding respectfully to Zara before addressing them both. "News from Cheyenne. Thought you'd want to know right away. Jacob Blackburn's been sentenced. Judge gave him 20 years for land fraud, attempted murder, and a list of other crimes long as my arm." A tension Reed hadn't realized he was still carrying seemed to dissolve at the news. Beside him, Zara exhaled softly, her hand finding his. "Thank you for bringing word," she said to Jenkins. "Would you like to stay for supper? We've plenty to share." After the deputy had gone, Reed and Zara remained on the porch, the news settling around them like a final closing of a chapter. Zara's hand rested on the gentle swell of her stomach, their child growing safely beneath her heart. "It's really over," she murmured. "He can't hurt anyone else now." Reed nodded, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Justice has a way of finding people eventually, even out here." Zara turned her face up to his, the last rays of sun gilding her features. "Do you ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't found me that day?" "I try not to," Reed admitted. "But I do know this: I'd still be searching for something without knowing what it was. You gave my life purpose, Zara. You and this ranch and the family we're building." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "From buried in sand to building a future." "It's not the story I expected." "The best stories rarely are," Reed replied, pressing a kiss to her hair. As night fell over the Wyoming plains, bringing with it a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch, Reed Zimmerman reflected on the strange path that had led him here. From a drifting cowboy with no fixed home to a husband, soon-to-be father, and rancher with deep roots in this land. All because he had followed an instinct to investigate something out of place in a vast desert. His hands, now fully healed though bearing scars that would never fade, still carried the memory of that desperate digging. But they also carried the softness of Zara's touch, and would soon know the delicate weight of his child. Hands that had bled to save a life now worked to build one, and Reed couldn't imagine a more worthy purpose for them. In September of 1880, Zara gave birth to a son they named Thomas Reed Zimmerman, in honor of both his grandfather and his father. The boy had his mother's honey blonde hair and his father's blue eyes, a perfect blend of them both. Thomas Owens, now a doting grandfather, insisted on building a proper nursery addition to their cabin, working alongside Reed despite his advancing years. As their son grew, so did the Lazy O. By 1885, it was the most prosperous ranch in the territory, employing dozens of hands and running thousands of head of cattle. Reed and Zara had added a daughter to their family, little Emma Grace, who had her father wrapped around her finger from the moment of her birth. The story of how they met became part of local folklore, embellished with each telling but true in its essence, a tale of courage, sacrifice, and love that had overcome the harshest test imaginable. Visitors to Opal would often hear some version of it in the saloon or general store, about the outlaw gang that buried a young woman in the desert and the cowboy who dug until his hands bled to save her. For Reed and Zara, however, it wasn't the beginning of their story that mattered most, but everything that came after. The quiet moments and everyday triumphs that built a life together, the legacy they created in their children and their land. The love that had begun in desperation but flourished in peace. And sometimes, on clear nights when the stars shone like diamonds over the Wyoming plains, Reed would take Zara's hand in his, tracing the scars that remained, and remember how close they had come to never having this life at all. In those moments, gratitude would wash over him like a physical force, and he would pull her close, whispering thanks for the twist of fate that had led him across the desert that day. I would find you again, he would tell her. In any life, in any circumstance, I would find you. And Zara, her amber eyes reflecting the starlight, would smile and reply, I would be waiting for you to dig me out. It was enough. It was everything. It was a love born in the harshest circumstances but destined to thrive, like wildflowers after a desert rain, unexpected, resilient and beautiful beyond measure.